Hello, my name is Zhenya and you are watching UI Courage channel. In this video, I would like to talk of some peculiarities, using the example of the first Russian and then Soviet automobiles. In the history of automobile manufacturing of the United States and Europe in beginning 20th century, there were many famous people, inventions and different companies that offered their cars. However, in Tsarist Russian was everything different. The Tsarist Russian was an agrarian and backward country, and they have no industrial revolution until to beginning 20th century. It was not even necessary talk about the production of any of their own cars. The history of the Russian and then Soviet automobiles begins a few years before Revolution 1917, when Tsar was overthrown. In that time, cars were already being used all over the world, but they were not present in Tsarist Russia due to the complete lack of any proper industry. Funny, the realization that Russia needs their own automobile industry come only with beginning First World War. The Tsarist elite understands they need a Russian car, but they have no possibility to production car. Therefore, Tsarist Russia decided to make a deal with Italian Fiat to produce Italian Fiat in Moscow. They used its own resource, then eventually call it a Russian car. A contract was signed with Italian Fiat for supplies of necessary parts, as well as the training of workers, assisting in the construction of the enterprise and much more. All this was done a few years before revolution. Then Bolshevik revolutions happened and everything stopped. However, the program of create a Russian automobile was massive. Originally, the construction of the 6 factories in 6 different cities was planned so that automobile could be produced not in just one city, but it's 6 at once. The construction of the factory began in 1916, and by the time of the 1970 revolution, only the workshop in Moscow had been completed. Initially, production was planned as licensed assembly of Fiat, with almost all components supplied from Italy, while the simplest ones were produced in Russian, frame, body, etc. The necessary components and even machines were imported from the United States. However, due to the revolution, deliveries stopped, and from 1970 to 1990 only 1,319 trucks were assembled. It was done because all components were imported. They were either ready-made units and assemblies or blanks that they processed at the factory. Parallel to Fiat, they try to establish this assembly of the American truck White Todd, but later they give preference to Fiat. Actually, 250 trucks were imported before revolution. Over the years, they became run out and needed repair. Someone from country leadership suggested repairing these trucks on Fiat assembly plant. The foolishness of the situation was the stupid leadership thought the factory could assemble one type of truck. They could repair a completely different type of truck, because everything made of iron. So everything is the same. So only half of trucks were repaired using parts from Fiat. There was not even talk about producing one's parts.
Hi, it's Ira talking. After the revolution, the Red leadership understood that the country needed its own cars anyway and its own production. They even remembered the old agreement with Fiat. At that time, the enterprise was almost 90% completed and was already prepared to create the first cars. And so, in 1919, the first 10 cars were assembled a trial batch. But the Red leadership did not want to pay according to the contract that had been concluded earlier. As usual, the Russians wanted to deceive everyone, steal technology, and keep the money. Seeing all of this, Fiat stopped supplying the necessary components, such as ignition system, generators, carburetors, various parts that were manufactured on more precise equipment and were not available in the Soviet Union of the 1920s. At the same time, Soviet engineers tried to modify and simplify something to establish production based on the technologies that were available to them. In Soviet propaganda, it was said everywhere that Soviet engineers took an Italian car and improved it specially for Russian roads. But in reality, all these improvements were optimization and simplification of the design at the expense of quality and the comfort. In order to be able to produce these cars, due to the lack of necessary components, due to all circumstances, the production of this car completely stopped in 1924. About 7,000 cars were produced in 5 years. After that, there were attempts to create some other cars based on existing ones, but nothing worthwhile came out of it. And then Soviet Union decided to buy a whole production line along the conveyor and all the equipment for car production from Henry Ford. How they came to this idea and who negotiated with whom, it's not important in the context of this video. That is interesting here is the general approach of Russians to any production.
Henry Ford had bought a conveyor to create of two types of cars. It's passenger cars and trucks. Both these cars had one engine, which simplified the task. And here, the most comical and perhaps ironical parts begins. By the end of the 1920s, Henry Ford understood that their Ford A and Ford 2A cars would be morally and technically outdated in few years in the United States. It was unprofitable to keep and produce them further. But at the same time, he had a whole conveyor with the machines, equipment, worked out technology, which needed to be disposed somewhere in order to build something new instead of outdated production. And here is Soviet Union come to rescue, gladly buy outdated technology from Henry Ford and pay for this good money. But irony is that for United States there were already outdated technology, but for Soviet Union there were too advanced, and some of these units were either impossible or very difficult to replicate. With the purchase of the conveyor from Henry Ford, the Soviet Union created the whole program for creating its own automobile complex.
Then something similar to what happened with Fiat happened. Some components were supplied from the United States, and it was all under the control of some specialists from the United States. So the first cars produced in the Soviet Union had relatively good quality. However, by the 1940s, the quality became worse because they switched to producing all the components themselves, and the management was also exclusively Soviet. In 1938, the 2A model was modernized into the 2M model, but in reality, all the modernization involved was maximum simplification of the design. For example, the car originally had beautiful oval shape front fenders that covered it with the wheels, but it was more difficult to produce such fenders in the Soviet Union than to simplify makes square arcs. In 1938, they started making square fenders because functionally they were still normal, and the appearance was all for the wealthy, which we didn't need. This was much easier and cheaper to produce. The same applied to other elements. For example, in trucks, they stopped installing brakes on the front wheels after 1938, and there was only the headlight because it was cheaper and it was believed that the one headlight was enough for the driver. Some elements of the cabin were replaced with wooden inserts instead of steel ones, and there are many more examples like this. As for the engine, it remained unchanged, but the compression ratio was raised for better quality fuel, which increased the power from 40 horsepower to 50 horsepower. Perhaps this is one of the few examples that can really be called modernization.
At the same time, Soviet Union tried launch some program to increase production capacity and tried to open factory in another cities to production these cars. But this didn't get any significant results due to the lack of proper industry and metallurgy.
Thus, by the start of the war in 1941, the Soviet Union had about 500,000 cars produced over these 10 years. For example, under Lend-Lease, only 427,000 cars were transferred from the United States, and all these cars were much better and of higher quality than that was in the Soviet Union. Well, as for the war in the Soviet Union, that's a topic for another video. The point is that after receiving Studebakers through Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union had new and truly advanced cars for that time. Later, these cars were detailed and produced in the Soviet Union as copies of the original cars that they were able to replicate. But the topic of Studebakers is perhaps for another separate video as well. In conclusion, we want to say that the Soviet Union did not have the industry or ability to even simply replicate or copy some of the technologies that, for example, the United States has already mastered in early 2000th century. By the way, the Gas Double M car, which is the modern version of the Ford, was produced in the Soviet Union until 1958. Could you imagine buying a new car in the United States in 1958 that was relevant 30 years ago? And these cars were taken out of production in the Soviet Union because they started producing other cars based on the Studebaker. And by the way, this car is called ZIL 157 and was produced in Russia until 1994.
That we don't understand in this whole situation is that no leader of Soviet Union or Russia whoever did anything to modernize industry in order to produce something to high quality. Yeah, and you know what? We have some saying, if say word to word, my broken English, sorry. So if something good came in Russian, it's turned to the crap. And if crap came in the Russian, it just takes less time to turn it into the crap. So that's the story. It's all from us. Thank you for your attention. Write the comments and see you soon.